Speaking to Chinese Filipino businessmen, Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte insisted China's growing military presence in the South China Sea is not intended to confront its Asian neighbors, but to defend against the United States.
Now, nandyan ang China building structures and military bases, I must admit it. But is it intended for us? You must be joking. It's not intended for us. The contending ideological powers of the world, or the geopolitics, has greatly changed. It's really intended against those who the Chinese think would destroy them, and that is America.
China claims almost the entire South China Sea, a strategic waterway over which trillions in goods travel every year. It contests territorial claims with Brunei, Indonesia, Taiwan, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam. Malcolm Cook, a senior fellow at the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore, tells VOA's Victor Beattie there are reasons that leaders like Mr. Duterte seek to maintain warm ties with Beijing, and one is his audience.
The Filipino-Chinese business community has long been very strong supporters of good relations with China and was critical of President Aquino when President Aquino decided to take China to an international tribunal over the disputes in the South China Sea. So President Duterte had a very welcoming audience for his comments. Second is, particularly President Duterte, but not only President Duterte, many others in Southeast Asia, I think misrepresent the South China Sea dispute as being predominantly between the United States and China, and hence none of their business. As President Duterte was trying to argue, the Chinese have unlawfully built an artificial military base on the Philippine continental shelf. That's the problem that President Duterte seems to be unwilling to address. Whether the Chinese built it in their military rivalry with the United States is a second question. Philippine sovereignty is being actively infringed upon by China, and the Duterte administration seems to be doing nothing about it.
Is his position on the South China Sea and his relationship with China influenced by a fait accompli approach, that China is going to do it anyway regardless of what the UN has decided, or is this appeasement?
Even during the presidential campaign and in 2016, when Duterte wasn't president yet, he took that line that you mentioned, a fait accompli, saying China's too big and powerful for the Philippines to go to war against, and hence we can't stop what they're doing in the South China Sea, so we may as well focus on other parts of our relationship. The preceding administration never took a military approach to the South China Sea because of the huge difference, but did take an international legal approach and comprehensively won a tribunal ruling that President Duterte has put aside. So President Duterte is certainly correct that on the military terms, the Philippines can't and probably shouldn't try to do anything against Chinese actions. But that's not the only avenue the Philippines has to pursue its sovereign rights, something President Duterte administration seems to be less willing to do than the Aquino administration.
Meanwhile, the Philippine ambassador to Beijing warned the risks of miscalculation have risen between China and the U.S. He said the Chinese Navy is now challenging the dominance of the U.S. 7th Fleet. The publication SOFPREP, military news of the Special Operations Forces community, said new satellite imagery and aerial photos show China's artificial islands now host substantial, largely complete air and naval bases, and new construction continues apace despite diplomatic overtures between China and fellow claimants. Malcolm Cook said these amount to Chinese military bases, some illegally constructed on the maritime zones of other countries, and appear to be designed to, among other things, track U.S. nuclear submarine activity. China has urged the United States to exercise restraint in imposing tariffs or import quotas after the U.S. Commerce Department recommended President Donald Trump take action against the practice of dumping cheap steel and aluminum imports on the U.S. market. Mr. Trump is expected to make his decision known by April. China warned it would, quote, take necessary measures to protect its own reasonable interests. The Trump administration last month imposed tariffs on imported washing machines and solar panels from Asia. IHS Global Insight's chief economist Rajiv Biswas tells VOA's Victor Beattie from Adelaide, Australia, there is intense focus on what the U.S. will do.
What is unknown at the moment is how the tariffs would be applied if they are indeed decided to go ahead with that. Because at the moment the discussion is about a potential 24% tariff, but a key question is whether the tariff will be applied, for example, to all steel exporting countries who export to the U.S., or will it be targeted with a sort of positive list of countries that would be, say, exempt from these higher tariffs. So the construction of how these tariffs will be phased in is very important as to how the reaction will be globally. Canada is actually the biggest exporter of steel to the U.S., accounting for about 16% of total U.S. imports. And then you've got Brazil, South Korea, Mexico as other big suppliers of steel. And China is way down the list and only supplies 1% of U.S. steel. So I think the rhetoric from China doesn't necessarily match the actual volume of steel they're exporting to the U.S.
Well, the president has already imposed tariffs on washing machines and solar panels, most of them coming from Asia. Are we on the cusp of a trade war?
Well, I certainly think we're facing a year when trade frictions could be one of the big threats to the global economic outlook. The world economy is doing very well right now. Things are looking very positive, but one of the important risks to the outlook for this year is rising trade frictions. And of course, we've seen many years where trade liberalization has boosted world trade and world growth, according to most economic analyses. So this could be, a retrograde step if we see countries putting in new tariffs and potential retaliation against the U.S. from other countries in response to these tariffs on steel and aluminium if they are actually imposed. So a lot will depend on how it's applied. The U.S. has already been using other ways of trying to address these concerns about unfair trade, particularly anti-dumping actions under WTO procedures. So those are probably the preferred course of action because they are allowed under WTO rules, whereas this is more an individual decision by the U.S. to pursue a certain course of action that could be challenged in the WTO system as well. So it could be a difficult year ahead in terms of trade policy and rising trade frictions, I think.
Meanwhile, Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull arrives in Washington this week for talks with President Trump. And according to the Australian Financial Review, citing an unnamed U.S. official, the two countries plus India and Japan are discussing a possible alternative to China's multi-billion-dollar Belt and Road Development Initiative. It is described as a nascent or emerging plan. Rajiv Biswas said Japan is already involved in such development projects in countries like Vietnam, and a new multinational plan would be a welcome development for Asia, where some countries don't necessarily want to rely solely on Beijing for such assistance.